Our first question on this first Overflow segment, and this question is from Cheryl. She says, to circle back to the topic of the primary reason for the church or attending church, I understand that the primary reason is not for us. How does that align with Ephesians 4, which states that the church is to equip God's people to do his work and to build up the church? Cheryl, thank you very much for that question. So I want to start off with what Ephesians chapter 4, and you're referring to verse 11, what it actually states. Because what Paul is talking about in Ephesians 4:11, and this is what he says basically, that Christ gave us, the church, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. So he was talking about the roles that Jesus Christ has established, and that the responsibility of those folks is to equip God's people for works of service. So it doesn't say that the church is responsible for equipping God's people for works of service. It says those roles, the people who hold those roles, their responsibility is to equip God's people for works of service. And that service then turns into us, the church, being built up and eventually becoming fully mature to where we attain to the measure of the fullness of Christ. And during this series, my point was this, that we live in a culture today where so much of our religious practices really centers around us when religion itself, and we're not talking about just all religion, we're talking about this relationship that we have with God through Jesus Christ. That religion is really centered around God, not us. So there's so many people put themselves at the center of religion to where they determine whether or not their involvement of the church is any value to them, as opposed to determining whether going to church has any value to God. Does that make sense? To where we're determining whether or not we're going to worship by assessing whether or not it has any value to me, as opposed to determining to worship, assessing whether or not it has value to God. And see, that's the point. When we begin to see our religious practices as centering around us, the perspective is off. Everything that we do is really supposed to be about God. The primary purpose of the church is to serve God, not to make people's lives better. Please hear me on this. And I said this in the message, right? You've got to be very careful with what I said. The primary purpose. This doesn't mean there's not a secondary purpose or a tertiary purpose. Doesn't mean that, but the primary purpose of the church is to serve God. Does the church also better people's lives in the teaching of God's word? Yes, that absolutely happens. It just so happens, though, that's not the primary purpose. See, the primary purpose is what is outlined by Peter when he talks about how we are these living stones for the purpose of having this, being built into this royal priesthood to serve our God with these acts of spiritual service. So the reality is the church itself, the primary purpose of the church is to serve God. The purpose of the church leader is to equip God's people to serve God. So those are actually kind of two different things, or that's how it would least fit together, right? And I think that one of the things we absolutely have to consider about this is we really got to consider the perspective that we have about the role of church and our personal roles in regard to our relationship with God. Because if we don't recognize that we are designed, right, created and designed by God as servants, then we miss everything. God doesn't exist for us. We exist for him. I hope I answered your question, Cheryl. I hope maybe if there were others who had a similar question, I hope I answered it for you. I will see you again next week. Every week we will drop an overflow question if there are questions to drop, and hopefully there will be, but I will see you again next week with another overflow question. Peace. I look forward to seeing you Sunday morning at Designers Way Christian Church here in Tampa, Florida. Love y'all.